Yeah, before we start, I just want to say this. I just want to mention two interesting machshavas of the Gemara that are not in the Even Shelaima, but it's Nogea, the Parsha of the week. He points out that, number one, Parshas Tetzaveh is the only Parsha in the Torah from the time that Moshe Rabbeinu was born that Moshe Rabbeinu's name is not mentioned. Obviously, before he was born, like in Chumash Bereshis, Moshe is not mentioned, but from Parshas Shemos to the end of the Torah, he is mentioned in every Parsha except Tetzaveh. So there is a medrash that says that this is the fulfillment of the curse that Moshe Rabbeinu imposed on himself. Because when HaKadosh Baruch Hu told Moshe after the Chet HaEgel, I want to destroy the Jewish people, and I will make a private covenant with you. So Moshe said, either you accept them, or macheni na misifrecha, erase me from your book. Now, he did it on a condition. He said, erase me from your book if you don't forgive the Jewish people. But Chazal say that the klala of a chacham, even when there's a condition, will have a certain fulfillment, even if the condition is not fulfilled. In other words, it creates a certain absoluteness to it. So if Moshe Rabbeinu cursed himself, so to speak, that he will be erased from Hashem's book, so even though the condition was not fulfilled because Hashem forgave the Chet HaEgel, but there has to be some kiyum of his curse, and that is why his name is omitted from this parsha. But that doesn't explain why this parsha. It could be any parsha. In fact, if anything, logically, it would have been more logical to remove his name from a parsha after the Chet HaEgel instead of before. So the Gra is Meisif that the remez is that Parshas Tetzaveh is always read the week of Zayin Adar, which is the day that Moshe Rabbeinu died. So the notion is that this week of Tetzaveh, he is absent from the world, and that is why that is the parsha that the Torah picked to be Makayim the Inyan of Macheni na misifrecha. Now this doesn't work in a leap year, but nevertheless the basic parshios are based on a Shana Pshuta, and in a Shana Pshuta, Tetzaveh is the end of the week of Zayin Adar, and Zayin Adar already was this particular week. That's thought number one. Now, thought number two is interesting, and this is actually just something to clarify a little bit. Parshas Truma is the Mishkan, the tzivuyim of the Mishkan. Parshas Tetzaveh is largely the tzivuyim regarding the Big Day Kahuna, which are necessary for the Avodah. One little question, which I'm not going to answer, but it's a question you can think about, is that's a pretty good division, meaning Mishkan and then Big Day Kahuna. But the problem is, at the very end of Parshas Tetzaveh, there is a tzivoy about the Mizbeach Hazav. There are two altars in both the Mishkan and in the Beis HaMikdash. There is the outer altar in the courtyard, and that's where all the korbanos were brought. And in the midbar, that's called the Mizbeach HaNechoshes, because it was wood panels covered with copper. In the Beis HaMikdash, it actually was not copper. In the Beis HaMikdash, it was stone, Mizbeach Havanim. So that's one Mizbeach, and that's described in Parshas Truma. But then there's a second Mizbeach that's in the Heichal itself, or in the Mishkan, or the Heichal itself, and that is the golden Mizbeach. And you didn't bring korbanos there, but that was for Ketores. Now, l'chaira, that should have been explained along with the Mizbeach and the other Kalim of the Mishkan, and yet the Torah does not explain the Mizbeach HaKetores till after it goes through all the Big Day Kahunas at the end of Parshas Tetzaveh. So I'm not even going to answer that, but that's a question to think about. Why is the Torah deicha, the whole explanation of the Mizbeach HaNechoshes, only after it goes, Mizbeach Hazav rather, only after it goes through all of the Big Day Kahuna, and it didn't explain it in connection with the Kalim. Okay, that's one question. But going back to the Big Day Kahuna, here's the thing. One of the Big Day Kahuna of the Kohen Gadol was the Chayshin, the breastplate, and the breastplate had 12 Avanim Tovos, 12 very precious jewels, upon which was engraved a name of the Shevet of Yisrael, Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, etc. And in this cheshbon, you only have 12 stones, so that actually means Levi was counted, and Yosef was counted instead of Ephraim and Menashe, because if you count Levi and Ephraim and Menashe, you have 13. So the way the cheshbon is on the Avonim of the ephod, the avonim of the choshen, is that you do count Levi, and the shevet of Ephraim and Menashe are counted as one. They're counted as shevet Yosef. Now, we also have something called the Urim V'Tumim. Now, here's something this is just Pashup Shot. Maybe it's Pashup to you, but a lot of people do get confused. A lot of people think the Urim V'Tumim is the same as the Avonim. They think, oh, the Urim V'Tumim is the breastplate of the Kohen Gadol with the jewels. That's not true at all. For example, the Mishnah says in Saita that during the Bayis Sheni, we did not have Urim V'Tumim, but we Vadai had, the Kohen Gadol Vadai had the Choshen. So the way to understand it is that the Choshen, including the Avonim of the Choshen, is like hardware, and the Urim V'Tumim is like software. In other words, what the Urim V'Tumim is it's a klaf. It's a piece of parchment. And upon the parchment were inscribed certain names of Hashem. We don't know exactly which names. And when the parchment was placed in the folds, because the Choshen folded up, so they put this klaf in the folds, so the Choshen now became activated to be a prophetic medium to communicate messages from Hashem by the lighting up of the letters. So the Urim V'Tumim is the klaf that empowered the Choshen to be or the Avnei Choshen, to be a prophetic medium. So when we say the Bayis Sheni didn't have Urim V'Tumim, either that means the klaf was lost, or it could even have meant we had the klaf, but it didn't work, because after all, the Bayis Sheni, we didn't have Nevuah either, and Urim V'Tumim is a chelik of Nevuah, so part of the histalkus of Nevuah was we didn't have Urim V'Tumim. Now, how did the Urim V'Tumim work? So the Kohen Gadol wears the Choshen with the Avanim, and people would ask questions, but you couldn't ask private questions. You couldn't ask, like, what Parish should I learn, for whatever. I mean, the Gra says you could ask a Navi those questions. You could ask a Navi, like, what should I learn second Seder? And the Navi would tell you. But the Urim V'Tumim was only for public questions about the nation. You couldn't ask private questions to the Urim V'Tumim. But you'd ask a question, should we go to Milchama, should we not go to Milchama? So the letters would light up from the tribes, spelling out a word, Kain Olo. That's why you have to be the questions have to be, answerable. The Urim V'Tumim is not good for long sentences. It's not like AI, chat, or whatever it would be. You got to have like yes or no answers. Now, there is a machlokes rishonim when we say the letters lit up. Did they light up that anybody could see those lights? Or only the Kohen Gadol could see it through a type of nevuah? Meaning some say it didn't light up that everybody would see, but the Kohen Gadol would see, although he'd have to look down in that way. So the Gra says like this. The Gra says, as a Davar Pashat, that sometimes messages had to be deciphered because the letters that spelled out the relevant words were not in order, because it's based on the tribal spellings. So it took a Ruach HaKodesh not only to see the lit letters, but to know which order. So the Gra says, based on this, we have a Gavaldiga understanding of the story of Chana. Go back to the book of Shmuel, right, the beginning of the book of Shmuel. So Chana comes with her husband Elkanah and her co-wife Penina. Penina has many children. Chana has no children. And at that time, this is before there's a Beis HaMikdash, they're going to the Mishkan in Shilai, etc. And Chana is davening. In fact, all of the halachas of Shmona Esrei about moving your lips and not making a sound, we learn from Chana. Chana is the one that taught us how to daven. But apparently, Eli did not have those halachas yet. In other words, Chana, on her own, figured out this was right, and Chazal were koveya it based on her. But Eli says, Eli thought she was drunk. V'yachshiveha Eli l'shikora. Eli thought she was a shikora and said to her, how can you enter the Mishkan in a state of drunkenness? And she said to him, Lo, Isha kishera anochi. I am a kosher woman. I am a good woman. I am pouring out my heart to Hashem. And Eli gave her a bracha that she should have a son, and of course she was zocha to have a son Shmuel. So here's what the Gemara says. When Eli sees this woman moving her lips, and he thinks she's not doing it proper, that she's drunk and like talking to herself, so he asks the Urim V'Tumim, is she emistic or not? So the letters that lit up were the Chaf of Yisachar and the Shin of Shimon, just looking at the tribe, the Shin of Shimon, the Chaf of Yisachar, the Reish of Ruvain, and the Hay of, which Shevet has a Hay? Yehuda, right? So he sees 4 letters, but he has to decipher what those letters are. So he read the letters as Shikora, drunk. And she says, Isha Kishera. You're not reading the letters right. Those 4 letters should not be read Shin Chaf Reish Hey. They should be read Chaf Shin Reish Hey. And that's why she uses the Lashon, Lo Adoni, you are not my master in this. Meaning, Nistalka Mimenu Ruach HaKodesh. He lost Ruach HaKodesh. Meaning, he saw the letters that were lit up, but for whatever the reason, HaKadosh Baruch Hu was Maineah from him the ability to properly decipher the letters. So the Urim V'Tumim was not an easy thing. It took a high level of Ruach HaKodesh, and that is why when we lost Nevuah, we also lost Urim V'Tumim. But the point I want to make, though, is that does not mean we lost the Choshen. It just means we lost the prophetic power of the Urim V'Tumim. Now, that's an interesting thing. In Halacha, there are 2 types of wars that a Jewish nation could fight. There is what is called a Milchemes Mitzvah, which has 3 types of Milchemes Mitzvah. One is a war against the 7 nations of Canaan, which are not around today. The other is the war against Amalek. And the third is a defensive war. If we're attacked, no matter by anybody, we have a mitzvah to fight. Now, that's a Milchemes Mitzvah. Milchemes Mitzvah is obligatory, and even today, theoretically, it's obligatory. That raises an interesting question. Maybe we'll talk another time. So how come Yeshiva guys don't go to the army? If we learn that it's a defensive war, okay, we'll talk about maybe some other time. I don't want to do that now. Now, the thing is that there's another type of war called Milchemes Rishus, optional wars. Well, what's an optional war? Well, by definition, it has to be a non-defensive war, because a defensive war is Milchemes Mitzvah. So that means it's a non-defensive war of aggression. That sounds kind of funny. In other words, it's not a mitzvah to be aggressive and try to conquer, Turkey or whatever it is, but rishus. What? The Torah allows the Jewish people to simply proclaim war against a nation that's not threatening them and conquer them? It's a rishus. Not a mitzvah, it's a rishus. Well, what on earth is that? That sounds pretty immoral to me. I mean, that's what Saddam Hussein does or Putin does in the Ukraine, right? So what's going on? So the thing you have to understand is that maybe the translation is not quite right. It's a rishus in the sense that it's not a mitzvah, but there are certain steps that have to be taken. Number 1, you have to have a melech. Okay, we don't have a melech today. Number 2, you have to have the approval of the Sanhedrin. But most importantly, the Urim V'Tumim has to say yes, which essentially means HaKadosh Baruch Hu has to give you permission through prophetic nevuah. In other words, it doesn't just mean we decide to do it. If Hashem gives us permission. Now, one could imagine, in most cases, the Eibishter is not going to give permission, because that's just aggression. Why would Hashem give permission? All right, there are different things. Maybe it's a nation that will be a future danger to the Jewish people. Maybe it's a nation that you could be makarev to the Sheva Mitzvahs. We don't know what Hashem's cheshbon is. But the important point is, Milchemes Rishus, despite its name, does not mean we can stam invade countries. We have to have the Rishus of the Urim V'Tumim, which means from Hashem. Which is why, Bizman Hazeh, it is not Shayach Milchemes Rishus, meaning to say it is absolutely forbidden for Jews to simply aggressively attack a nation that is not endangering them, unless they're Amalek or the 7 Umais, because without, number one, we don't have a Melech, number 2, we don't have a Sanhedrin, and most importantly, we don't have Urim V'Tumim, right? Now, those of you that, I don't know if anyone here went to Yale or whatever it is, but you may have seen in your life the seal of Yale University, their seal, and their seal are two Hebrew words, Urim V'Tumim. That is the Hebrew letters, is the seal, the official seal of Yale University, based on the idea of Urim, light, and Tumim, perfect, that, so to speak, that a little bit of a grandiose claim for Yale, but that's Taka Yale, that, we are the source of perfect light and understanding of everything. In colonial America and before, an educated person was supposed to know 3 languages, Greek, Latin, and Hebrew. Thomas Jefferson knew Hebrew and the like. And until recently, Harvard had, it goes back hundreds of years, but their minhag was there had to be a valedictory speech in Hebrew. They had to speak in Hebrew. So I think they stopped it, but they actually had that until very, very recently. So they say, maybe a Maisa, maybe it's a Purim story, I don't know, but they say a Maisa that when the Continental Congress decided to revolt against England, start the United States. So there was such a strong anti-British sentiment that when they were voting what should be the language of the United States, there were people who didn't want English to be the language of the United States. Hebrew was proposed as the language of the United States. Legend has it was defeated by 1 vote, meaning 1 vote. Now, I know what goes through your mind is, wow, life would have been so much easier. I'd come to Ohr Somayach, and I'd know Hebrew perfectly. Well, not so simple, because there was another shaila, what should the national language of Israel be? And that is, in the 1920s, there was some thought that Hebrew is such an old language, it doesn't have enough words for modern stuff. That's why we have to invent words, camera, computer. So there was some thought that maybe we should have another official language to have science and technology. So one of the proposals was German. That was before the Holocaust. And another proposal was English. So I was told that English would have become, right? So this would have been your mazel, right? So America would have adopted Hebrew. You'd show up at Ohr Somayach like everything is in English in Israel. What are you going to do? So HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Baruch Hashem, Lashon HaKodesh stayed for Klal Yisrael in Eretz Yisrael, and America got stuck with English. So everything works out in a good way. Okay, but now one final thought about the Urim V'Tumim, then we'll learn a little bit of Evan Shelaima, and that is, the Gemara in Yuma tells us on each stone was a Shevet's name, Reuven, Shimon, Levi, and in addition, there were 4 more things, Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Shiftei Yeshurun. So the way it worked is, every stone had 6 letters. So let's look at it this way. So Avraham is stone number 1. That's 5 letters. So it then, I'm sorry, not Avraham, Reuven. Reuven is 5 letters. So there's an Aleph of Avraham. So the first stone was Reuven, Aleph. The second stone is Shimon, which is also 5 letters. So that had Beis. Third stone is Levi, which is 3 letters. So you had Reish, Hey, Mem. So in the first 3 stones, you spelled out the name Avraham. And similarly with Yehuda, which is 5 letters, so you had the Yud of Yitzchak. Right? So you got the idea that each stone had 6 letters. So along with the Shevet, you did spell out Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov. But on the very last stone, there were more letters. It says Shiftei Yeshurun, the upright tribes, Shiftei Yeshurun. This is what the Gemara in Yuma says, that the Avnei HaChayshen had Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Shiftei Yeshurun. The Rambam in Hilchos Kli HaMikdash, when he describes the Chayshen and the Avanim, says it has Shiftei Ka, Shiftei Ka, Yud Hey, Shiftei Ka. So it may sound like a small difference, but the Chassam Sofer asks, and the Bavli says Shiftei Yeshurun. Why does the Rambam have Shiftei Ka? It's not exactly the same. So he gives a Gavaldik Teretz. Still, what's the marker of the Rambam? Still going to be a kasha. Do you remember the Gemara in Kedushin? Many of you learned this Gemara in Kedushin in the Sugya of Kibbud Aviyim, when it discusses Dama ben Nesina. Dama ben Nesina is the guy from Ashkelon, And the Gemara considers Dama ben Nesina to be the highest level of Kibbud Aviyim. That one time it says, one of the Avanim of the Chayshin, by the way, this is the raya that they had a Chayshin in the Bayis Sheni, because the mice is the Bayis Sheni. One of the stones of the Chayshin popped out, and the particular stone that popped out is Yoshveh, which is the stone of Binyamin, the last stone. Now, what is Yoshveh? Many say Yoshveh is a diamond. Now, it's interesting that in modern Hebrew, Yahalom is a diamond, and Yahalom is one of the other stones, but modern Hebrew is not a raya to Tanakh. And many say, B'lashon HaTorah, the word Yoshveh means a diamond. So this was the diamond of Binyamin popped out. They had to buy it for the Avodah. So Dama ben Nesina had a Yoshveh, but it was in a jewelry case, and the key to the case was under his father's pillow, and he didn't want to wake up his father, and apparently the Chachamim had to make the deal right away, so they had to find somebody else. So he was mafsid a lot of money because he didn't want to wake up his father, and Chazal say, as a reward for his kibbud aviyim, the next year he was given a para aduma, which also got a lot of money, and he was even offered more money than the jewel, but he said, I'll just take whatever you would have given me for the jewel. By the way, interesting question. Did Dama ben Nesina do the right thing? I mean, imagine this. Imagine it would happen to one of us. Let's imagine somebody comes and offers you $10 million, but you got to wake up your father to get the key. So you say, I'm not waking up my father. So dad gets up, and you say, Dad, I want you to know we gave up $10 million rather than wake you up from your nap. Now, what's your father's reaction going to be? Is he going to say, wow, I am so moved by your Gavaldik Kibbud Aviyim? He says, you idiots! So the question is, isn't it a davar pashut? If you know for sure that your father would want to be woken up, right? Of course you wake him up. What his ratzon is the covenant. So what's the pshat with Dama ben Nesina? So the emphasis is, some of us say an interesting pshat. The Gemara does not mean halachically he was right. Halachically he was wrong. But it's meshabeach him not for what he did. What he did was stupid. Say goy shekap, as they say. What he did was stupid. But the fact that he was willing to give up so much money shows devotion. And Chazal are meshabeach that devotion, even if lemaisa it was not carried out in a proper way. Okay. Now, it says the Chazam Sofer, why was it the stone of Binyamin that popped out? I mean, these things didn't happen that often. A stone just pops out and gets lost. Right? Why? So he tainas like this. He tainas that all of the Shvatim that were involved in Mechiras Yosef were tainted to some degree with sinas chinam. The brothers who sold Yosef, for sure, they were jealous. They hated him. And even Yosef himself, although he was the victim, but he was involved in bringing lashon hara about his brothers to the father. So Yosef too was involved in aspects of machlokes. The only brother who was not tainted with sinas chinam, with any type of sinner, was Binyamin, who was not involved in Mechiras Yosef bichlal. Now the word Yeshurun, shiftei Yeshurun, upright tribes, where do you find Klal Yisrael is called Yeshurun? You actually find it in Moshe Rabbeinu's bracha in Zayis HaBracha. In fact, it's also a chasna song. Vayehi b'Yeshurun melech. Hashem is the king in Yeshurun, in an upright nation. B'hisasef Rashei Am. When all of the heads get together, Yachad Shiftei Yisrael. So the shame Yeshurun only exists when there's Achdus in Klal Yisrael. So that's why Yeshurun is attached to Binyamin, because Binyamin is the symbol of Achdus. But says the Chasam Sofer, since in the Bayis Sheni there was sinas chinam among Klal Yisrael, we no longer merited to be called Yeshurun. And if we no longer merited to be called Yeshurun, the stone of Binyamin that had shiftei Yeshurun was lost. So says the Chasam Sofer, the Chachamim understood that the Binyamin stone was lost because we're not Zeicha to the title Yeshurun. So they understood that when they re-engrave a new stone, they can no longer use Yeshurun. They have Shiftei Ka. Apparently, it's not Ma'akiv, one way or the other. So the Chassam Sofer says it's not a stira. The Gemara in Yuma that says on the stone of Binyamin was Shiftei Yeshurun is before the Maisa of Dama ben Nesina. And the Rambam that says it was not Shiftei Yeshurun, it was Shiftei Ka, is after the Maisa of Dama ben Nesina, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu was showing us we're no longer on the Madrega to be called Yeshurun because of the Sinas Chidim. Again, that's a Gavaldig terrace. The only question is what's the marker of it? I mean, the Rambam can't stamaza, be medayik from a Maisa that they changed the inscription. So there must be a makor. Often, when the Rambam says things connected the Bavli, there's 3 basic answers that you can give depending on whatever you find. Answer number 1 is that the Rambam is sometimes Somayach on Yerushalmi, which is very interesting because even though there is a klal in halacha that when there's a machlokas, the Bavli and the Yerushalmi, the halacha is like the Bavli, the Rambam did not always follow that klal. The Rambam sometimes is machriya like the Yerushalmi. It's interesting lumbus, when and where and why, but it is a well-known yisaid that Achreinim say in many, many Rambams that the Rambam follows the Yerushalmi, not always, but sometimes keneged the Bavli. That's one answer. Another answer is that very often the Rambam had a different gersa in the Bavli. And this might be a gersa that doesn't come up in Rashi or Tosfos. Right? You learn Rashi and Tosfos, the Rambam doesn't fit Rashi, doesn't fit Tosfos. That's true. But the Rambam may have had a totally different gersa in the Bavli. And the third approach, which the Rambam himself says, is that he'll sometimes say that even though this sugya tells you this, but based on another sugya, we see that's a difference in the Rambam and Tosfos. You have many, again, I'm digressing here, but I think this is a worthwhile digression. You have many stiras in Shas, right? A typical Taisus. How can the Gemara say this? The Gemara there says that. There are stiras, right? Shas is a big thing, and in Shas there are many contradictions on different levels. So how does Tosfos commonly answer contradictions? By reconciling them. It's not a stira because that is talking about this case and that is talking about this case. In other words, Tosfos tries to make everything consistent. That is the sheet of Balei Tosfos. In fact, it's been well said, the same thing Amayraim do to Mishnayos and Breitowitz, Tosfos does to the Gemara. Contradiction, but the Rambam had a different approach. The Rambam simply said, Machlokas HaSugyos. Yeah, the Gemara here held that way, the Gemara held another way. Machlokas HaSugyos, and then we figure out which sugya should we paskin like. Now each derech has a maila and a chisaron. The maila of Tosfos' derech is that everything is consistent, everything fits. The chisaron of the derech is things fit because you have to put in extraneous things that are not in the sugya. In other words, what looks like a contradiction, you got to say, well, it's not a contradiction because of something. The Rambam, the maila is, no, we're not changing anything. This says A and this says B, contradiction, yeah. So both Gemaras are kipshutai, but then you have a contradiction. So the Rambam held, as a general shita, it is better not to twist the pashat pshat of a sugya, even if that'll leave you with a stira, than to try to give a teretz that would be adding things to the sugya that are not pashat. And Mamre, this is actually a yisaid in the different drachim of the Balei Tosfos and the Rambam in how they approach sugyas. So Mimele, you'll often find in a tshuva of the Rambam, when someone asks the Rambam, how can you paskin this way? The Gemara in Makos says this. So the Rambam will say, so instead of fa'emfering or reinterpreting the Gemara in Makos, the Rambam will say something like, yeah, the Gemara in Makos says this, But the Gemara in Shabbos says that, and I think the Gemara in Shabbos is more correct, l'halacha l'maisa. Right, so that takes away a lot of the lumdus that people do this. So therefore, when the Rambam contradicts the Bavli, as I say, there are three possibilities. Either he's somech on the Yerushalmi, or he has a different girsa, or even if he doesn't have a different girsa, he'll recognize a machlokas hasugyas, in which some other sugya goes another way. I frankly don't know where the shiftei ka fits in. I mean, the Chasam Sofer gives his yishuv, but you still have to know what's the makar of the Rambam that they went with shiftei ka. I'm not clear. The Chasam Sofer himself doesn't say what the makar is, but this is just a shtickle of the Chasam Sofer that's worthwhile to know. Okay, all right. Let's do a little Evan Shelaima for today. We're still in Perek Aleph. Yeah, I think we're up to Hay. I'm sorry, we're still Dalet, yeah. Okay, Dalet, this is Perek Aleph Dalet. And we're discussing about the idea of breaking your bad midos, because your midos are a container for all of the Torah. The Torah does not stay with you if you don't have the container. So sometimes a bad midos are like a container full of holes, so you gotta strip it away and build up a good container. So he then says in the Dalet, Kol echad tzarich ligdor atzmo min ha'averos. Every person must build fences to avoid committing sin. Right? So this is an interesting idea. Yeah, and even the little lashonos here are worthwhile to ponder. All of us know that Chazal make numerous gezeras. And what's a gezerah? Don't do X, which Doraisa is mutter, because maybe if you do X, you're going to come to do Y. Right? This is the familiar gezerah. A nazir is not allowed to walk into a vineyard. Why is that? The Torah doesn't forbid a nazir to walk by a vineyard. Yeah, but he walks in a vineyard. He'll pull off a grape to eat or whatever it will be. So this is a gezerah. So what's interesting is gezerahs are not only things the chachamim make, but we as individuals should make certain gezerahs in our own lives. That if a situation creates temptation, if a situation has sakana to drag you down, you don't simply say, I'm strong enough that I could walk through a difficult situation. Right? If you're a recovering alcoholic. So on one hand, you might say, I'm going to show that I'm really recovering, I've recovered. I'm going to go into the bar and I'm going to sit down with my friends who are drinking and I'm going to order a Diet Coke or whatever it would be. Okay, if you can do that, that's great. But the problem is, a person, you know that you have fallen and you failed many, many times. So you have to make a gezerah that I'm not going to go into these situations. So that's what the Gra means. You have to make a geder. You have to make a fence around the sin. Not just don't sin, but make a fence around the sin. But lefi teva mizgai. But it has to be something that fits your nature. It can't be something that creates like a lot of anxiety and difficulty. So let's assume, for example, a person has, just to give an example, a person has trouble staying awake when he's learning. That's a big Yetzer Hara. That it's not that a person needs to sleep, but somehow when we learn, we get tired. When we're not learning, we don't get, it's a strange phenomenon of why we get tired when we learn. But it happens. That's clearly a Yetzer Hara that exists in the world. So a person wants to work on improving himself in that way. So he says, it goes back to not going to two extremes. You have to do it bahadraga. He says, I'm going to force myself to stay up, 14 hours straight and learn. Well, once again, you have to work with your nature, meaning just like weightlifting or anything else, you challenge yourself. I'm going to stay awake for a half an hour or even 15 minutes today. And I'm going to force myself 15 minutes no matter what. Now that's manageable. Even that might be hard, by the way. That we make fun of those small things. Those small things, to learn for 15 minutes is not as easy. Well, hopefully, I hope it is relatively easy for you, but for many, many people, and many, many times, 15 minutes is not so easy. But you do it, and you stick with it, and then you go to 20, etc. So the Gra, again, this is just another way, because the Even Shelaima is quoting different Gras. So the Gra said the same idea in many, many places, in different words. So the Even Shelaima tends to bring it again. So you'll see a certain amount of repetition. But the notion of following your teva means that in any spiritual growth, you can't go against your natural inclination that much. You got to work with your natural inclination as opposed to try to be kaivish it. And this is equally true for parenting. I mean, a very classic example is many parents, they want their kids to sit at the Shabbos table and be well behaved. Now you sit. We're going to sing Zemiras, we have the Divrei Torah, and you sit and you behave yourself. Well, a parent has to realize that for a 4-year-old, a 5-year-old, a 6-year-old, an 8-year-old, it is not their nature to simply sit. They got to do things. And, it may look like they're wild, but part of it is playing. So it wouldn't be right for a parent to insist that a child not leave the table or play till the end of the meal. So what you can say to the child is, you got a bench with us, or whatever it is, or you have to sit a half an hour without fooling around. But then you let them play. You let them play. In fact, Kama V'Kama Ma'asim with the Chazon Ish and Rav Chaim Kanevsky, Zichrono Livracha, we just had the first yahrzeit. The Rav Chaim Kanevsky, of course, is the Chazon Ish's nephew. And because the Chazon Ish didn't have any children, it was more than even an uncle-nephew. It was really almost like a son. So Rav Chaim Kanevsky had essentially two fathers, the Chazon Ish and the Steiber, two Gedalim as fathers. And the story goes, when Rav Chaim Kanevsky was a little kid, they were walking together, the Chazon Ish, the Steipler, and Rav Chaim Kanevsky, and Rav Chaim Kanevsky started climbing trees or something, or whatever it is, and the father was very embarrassed in front of the Chazon Ish, And the Steipler said, no, you have to let a kid be wild, to expand himself, to express himself. Because when he gets older, he'll use that in Torah learning and in Chidushim and the like. That instead of telling a person, you got to control yourself, you got to inhibit yourself, you can't express yourself. The Chazon Ish said it was important for a child to even be wild a little bit and to play, because when you learn to express yourself, you're opening up your mind. And then you're opening up your emotions, you're opening up your feelings. So then when you commit to Torah, you'll have a certain openness in how you learn Torah. So kids have to be able to play, and kids have to be able to run around, and kids have to be able to not necessarily have to sit at the table for so many hours. And that's what the Gra again is saying, that you have to be madrich yourself, and also your children, according to their nature. Their nature. Don't go keneged their nature. Work with their nature. In fact, there's a word from Rav Hirsch, and I get in trouble when I say this because it sounds like a big, big chutzpah. So I always have to be makdim that this is Rav Hirsch, this is not me. So if you got a problem, complain to Rav Hirsch about it. But Rav Hirsch says by Yaakov and Esav, it says vayigdalu hanoarim. The young people grew up, and Esav became a hunter, and Yaakov became the one who sat in the tents of Torah. So Rav Hirsch says the critical problem here was vayigdalu hanoarim means Yitzchak and Rivka raised the twins the same way. Parents take twins; they raise twins the same way, dress them the same, and they're twins, even though they look different. So the idea was, you took Esav and you took Yaakov, you stuck them in the base medrash and said, you got to learn 12 hours today. So the problem is this, Rav Hirsch says. Esav had many kochos. Esav had energy. Esav was a go-getter. Esav could take initiative. But when you try to make it, but Esav could not sit and learn. That wasn't his thing. Esav was an activist. So Rav Hirsch says, when you try to raise your Esav like Yaakov's, not only are you not going to have a Yaakov, but the Esav who could have been righteous, who could have been good, who could have used his kaiches in a positive way, will rebel and become destructive. In In fact, Rav Hirsch goes on and says, that is why many years later, Yitzchak wanted to give Esav the brachas, because Yitzchak figured, I'll give Esav the brachas of Gashmias. He'll build the cities, he'll plant the fields, he'll make the businesses. In other words, I'll acknowledge his kaichas, and he'll use it to help Yaakov, like Yisachar and Zebulun. Problem was, too late. Esav already became a Rasha. In other words, this should have been done many, many years before. Meaning, had they been children, and Esav would be mechunech, according to his Techunas HaNefesh, he indeed could have been like Zevulun to Yisachar. But at this point, he was muchzik as a Rasha. Now, you understand why this is a controversial word. People are saying, well, what type of chutzpah is it that you're criticizing the parenting styles of the Avos of Yitzchak? Yitzchak and Rivka didn't take a proper parenting class. So I understand. I mean, it is a shtickle chutzpah. So, but here's the point. This is a beautiful machshava independent of whether you apply it to that particular context. All right, so let's assume we're not allowed to apply it to there. Rav Hirsch does apply it to there. It's not me. Rav Hirsch does apply it there. But even if you're going to say it's a chutzpah to apply it, okay, so let's not apply it there. As a yesod, it's what the Gra is saying. The chinuch has to be lefi tivai. If Esav needed to play basketball, then you got to give him basketball. Now, this is a major problem. Again, forgive me for digressing, but these ideas come up here. This is a major issue that yeshivas grapple with. Because obviously every yeshiva is trying to create an environment where you learn the whole day. Right? You learn as much as you can. A morning seder, an afternoon seder, a night seder, ben hastorah. Right? That's what we push. Torah is the most important thing. Problem is that not everybody is suited for that type of activity. So many people benefit gewaldig, and for many, not for many, but at least some people, I would say many people, for some people, suffer, and they would do better ruchniistika-wise in an environment that was, let's say, half-day learning, half-day working, or whatever it would be. So what are you supposed to do? So Rav Dessler had a very famous letter. Rav Dessler was asked about this. And Rav Dessler said like this, in every war, there are casualties. In every war, there are people who die for the cause. This is a little scary almost. Rav Dessler said, yeah, some people are going to be killed by a full-time learning system, and they would have been much better served by, let's say, a half thing. But in a half system, you're not going to produce Gedalim. You're not going to produce the big Talmidei Chachamim. So in a sense, this guy has to die for the cause. In order to produce Talmidei Chachamim, we have to have casualties. It's a little scary. In fact, some parents kind of resented it. They said, hey, so my son has to give his life, so your son will be a Talmid Chacham? If my son would do better in a different type of schedule, maybe less Gemara focused, maybe more Tanakh, different. I mean, there are also different ways of doing it. So this was Rav Dessler Shita. In other words, but the point I'm making is, Rav Dessler was makir that this is not lefi everybody's tchunas hanefesh. But he said, afal pichein, we have to have korbanos. The Chazain Ish, I think, had a little bit of a different tashkafa. The Chazain Ish maybe was more optimistic than Rav Dessler. The Chazain Ish held that almost everybody, if they stick to it, even if initially they're frustrated, even if initially they hate it, even if initially it's not their nature, eventually the Torah changes them eventually, and they will connect. In other words, it's a little different, right? Rav Dessler says, yeah, this isn't the right thing for you, but so what? We got to have this system, otherwise we're not going to have Gedolim. I think the Chazon Ish took the other view. Everybody can become a Gadol.
Isn't Esav Baraya to it?
Yeah, I think that the emes is, I think it's Yesh v'Yesh. I think this is Mamish, Elu El Divrei Elokim Chaim. I mean, the emes is some people who are not comfortable will follow the Chazon Ish's trajectory and eventually become the Talmid Chacham. Others may not, but Rav Dessler has the cheshbon of korbanos, so to speak. Now again, that sounds really bad, but remember, in a sense, in Shamayim, those korbanos are going to be rewarded. for their Hachzakas Torah, their contribution to producing the Gedolim. Well, they're going to have a chilek in that. Because I was part of a yeshiva, because I was part of an environment that created Gedolei Torah, I have a chilek in that Gedolei Torah. So this is still a big issue, meaning should we have different types of yeshivas, or should all yeshivas be the same? Meaning to say, the standard yeshiva curriculum is Gemara Be'iyun. I mean, that's the bread and butter. We have other things too. Even Shelaima, other things too. But, Gemara Be'iyun, no question, is the guts of every yeshiva. So the question is, should that be the case, or should we have different types of yeshivas? Maybe a Chumash yeshiva, a Halacha yeshiva. In other words, because different people are going to gravitate to different ways. So Rav Dessler's response would be, that might be better for Yechidim, but you're going to produce less Talmidei Chachamim as a whole. Right? So that's going to be the shikol. And that's a very difficult question. Mechanchim debate this. Rashi Yeshivas debate this to this very day. There are people that maintain we should have different types of tracks, and others say we shouldn't be Mishana, the Messiah, of the way Torah was taught. Okay, let's read a little bit more. Then he makes a point. They were still reading Sif Daled. Af she'ein darkei nechayna be'enei abriyos she'einan makirim b'tivai. So this is an interesting point that the Gra says. When you try to improve yourself, consistent with your nature, you should not feel bad because people think you're crazy. In other words, even if your derech does not appear to be the right derech in the eyes of other people, now I don't mean you're a bam, I don't mean people who are, have better insight than you. But just people think, people don't like what you're doing. They think, right? So let's assume, for example, a person is very emotional. And when they daven, they start crying. I don't mean on Yom Kippur. I mean a regular mincha, they start crying. So people might say, that guy is crazy. What is he crying all the time about? What's he doing? Says the Vilna Gaon, it's not your business to worry about what other people think. If this is the thing that brings you closer to Hashem, don't be embarrassed. In fact, that's the meaning of Pirkei Avos, have a uz kenamar. Be as impudent as a leopard. I mean, a leopard will go wherever he wants to go. He's not afraid of somebody that doesn't want the leopard to go there. So one should not be embarrassed that people are making fun of him in his avodas Hashem. Now, it's interesting that, you don't associate this with the Litvisha temperament. I mean, the Graf was Litvisha. But one thinks very much of the altar of Nevardik. Remember, this was the sheet of the altar of Nevardik? That you do what you need to do, even if people think you're crazy. And in fact, he had a certain sheet of Chinuch. He wanted his Talmidim to learn how to get embarrassed without being embarrassed. Because a lot of times we don't want to do something because we feel embarrassed. So he had crazy things. He would tell them, go to a butcher store and ask for nails. Go to a grocery and ask for clothes. So what happens? I go to a grocery store and I ask to buy a suit. So the guy says, are you nuts? Are you crazy? What are you coming here for? I get embarrassed. But you do that long enough, you don't get embarrassed anymore. So the Alter Nevardik held that getting embarrassed is a big mania in Avodas Hashem. We don't do things because it's embarrassing. People will look at us. Even within a yeshiva, people will look at us a certain way. So the Alter Nevardik held you have to be miskaber over getting embarrassed. Now, some people thought that was a chilul Hashem. The Alter Nevardik was there. Some people say, hey, if people think that Talmidim of this yeshiva go into grocery stores and ask for suits of clothing, they don't think of them as tzaddikim, they think of them as mishugayim. Okay, so that's a shikul, whether that was the right chinuch or not. Again, the Gedolim were arguing over this. But the general idea that fear of failure is a big mania in Avodas Hashem, the fear of being embarrassed. Even in secular life, this is a big inhibitor in negative ways. There was a survey, it's a secular survey, so it's not the Torah per se. They were asking people what is it that they regret not doing? So a lot of people say they regret that they never learned to play a musical instrument because they thought they couldn't do it well and they think it would have brought them pleasure. Or they say, I like to sing. Sing in the shower, whatever it is, not a niggin, but I like to sing in the shower. But I was embarrassed to join a singing club because I thought they would laugh at me. So what happens? The person loves to sing, but he's embarrassed, right? I'm embarrassed. Yeah. Right. They're not embarrassed. It's good. So the thing is, this is what the Gemara is saying. It's a big yesod. Don't get discouraged because people think you're crazy or you're doing something that's not right for you. If it's right for you, hispidus might be another example. They're crying out, you do it. But he does give one qualification. He says, "B'davar shu neged haTorah, lo yismach al sichloi." In other words, on one hand, do what is spiritual for you, and don't take into account what other people think. But you still have to work within the guidelines of halacha, meaning there is something that's going to bind you. A person might say, for example, I could have much more kavana if I sleep until chatzos, and then daven a gavaldiga kriya shema and shachris. But the problem is, it's keneged halacha. So actually, this was the big this is really what the first shar of Nefesh HaChaim is all about. Again, this is his polemic against Chassidus. Early Chassidus, there was a mahalech that the ikar in Avodah is your panemius. So if you could daven a better Shemona Esrei after Chatzos, do it. What's the use of a 7 a.m. or 6 a.m. fast tefillah where you're falling asleep? In fact, Nefesh HaChaim even makes a joke about this. He says, imagine a person who was, a housewife or whatever, they were working very hard for Pesach. And by the time the Seder comes, they are so dead tired. They say, I can't even stay up for anything. So I'll tell you what, I'm going to go to sleep. And tomorrow morning I'll be refreshed. And we will have the best Seder in the world with kavana and devekos. We'll just do it in the morning so we'll have a good night's sleep. Well, that doesn't make sense. Yeah, you have this great spiritual experience. You're not keeping Hashem's Torah. So the Gemara is warning us a little bit. On one hand, do your own thing. Don't look at what other people think is right. Do your own thing. On the other hand, be a little careful that doing your own thing has to be within the gevul of the Torah. By the way, I once, a few times, I gave this mashal. I was once teaching somewhere to a non-religious group about, imagine the absurdity of making your Pesach Seder the day after. So a woman put up her hand and said, we did that last year. We couldn't get the family, this, even more so. We couldn't get the family together for Pesach. We decided to make the Seder the day after Pesach. Day after Pesach, meaning the ninth day. She says, it was the best Seder we ever had. So the funny thing is, what Rav Chaim Volozhiner was trying to illustrate as an absurdity that's not shaykh in the world, it actually happens, right? So the things that the Frierdiker Gedoros said are not shaykh even to imagine, they actually do happen. And that's what the Gemara is warning. Because you understand the sakana here. He's really, psychologically, this is a very astute observation. Because as you tend to get more freewheeling and you develop your own thing, there is always a risk that you'll move outside the miskeret of halacha. So the Gemara says, do your own thing. Don't look at other people to tell you what you need to do. But you have to be within halacha. And he gives one example, but there are many examples. Lehisanais b'Shabbos. Let's say a person fasts and he really feels so pure, right? He has voluntary fast. He likes to fast. So he wants to fast on Shabbos. Well, in fact, he'll even make a cheshbon. Shabbos is the holiest day. And fasting makes me feel holier. So I'm going to fast on Shabbos because I want my Shabbos to only be about Hashem and not about eating or drinking. That's a logical cheshbon. It's logical. It happens to be wrong. The Eibishter says you don't fast. The truth is, at Tainis Chalaim, you do fast on Shabbos. Okay, but other than where the halacha permits it, you don't fast on Shabbos, right? Now, this gives rise to one interesting practical issue, and I'll end here. That is davening b'yechidus versus davening b'tzibur. And this is a real issue that somebody faces. Let's assume that a person's working on tefillah. I want to daven. And the problem is, I have more kavanah. This is not always the case, but sometimes the person says, I have more kavanah when I daven by myself than when I daven with a minyan. Either because the minyan is too fast, even if it's not a yeshiva minyan, certainly the average shul minyan, maybe less so in Eretz Yisrael, but think about the typical United States minyan or whatever it is, 20-minute chakras or the like. So it's either too fast or I'm not comfortable, or even things like some people are davening too loud, or they're walking around, or they're talking. When I'm by myself, I can focus, I can concentrate, I can think about the words. So a very interesting question. It's a practical question. Is it better for me to daven b'yechidus with greater, more intensive kavanah? Or is it better for me to daven b'tzibur even though my kavanah is going to be diminished? Right? What's going to be the shikul here? So really, it kind of depends on whether tefillah b'tzibur is a chayva. Is there in other words, the Gemara certainly says davening with a minyan is a good thing. That's no machlokus at all about that. But is it a chiv? Am I mechuyev to daven b'tzibur? Or no, it's a good thing, but if I want to daven... So Rav Chaim Kanevsky, he's not the first one, many Rishonim, but Rav Chaim Kanevsky paskined over and over and over and over again that tefillah b'tzibur is a chayva. It's a chayva. So if it's a chayva, then you're back to the Gra's teaching. You can't be mavater on a chayva because you have more kavana in another situation. However, there are many Rishonim, maybe I shouldn't say it because I don't want to weaken anybody's commitment, but there are many Rishonim, it's not a chayva. They say it's an eitzah tova, it's a good place to be makabel tefillah, but as a chayva, it's not a chayva. If it's not a chayva, once you say not a chayva, so avada you shouldn't miss minyan, but it would seem that there would be room to then factor in my individual kavanas. Okay, so again, be very careful. I'm not saying miss minyan to go to sleep. We're talking about minyan because to enhance your davening. Now, L'maisa, Rav Moshe has a tshuva that he seems to say that even if tefillah b'tzibur is not a chayva, the zechus of a tzibur is a different nekuda, is so great that it will compensate. It'll give you more than you would get. Right? In other words, I daven b'yechidas with kavana. I daven b'tzibur without kavana. Rav Moshe says the zechus of the tzibur will give you more than your kavanah would give you in your private. That's a separate cheshbon. But L'maisa, interestingly enough, though, I saw a story from the Chazon Ish, which is interesting, that Rav Chaim Kanevsky obviously would have known the story, but he doesn't refer to it, maybe because he's afraid it would encourage people not to go to minyan, where somebody asked the Chazon Ish exactly this question. I have more kavanah when I daven by myself. When I daven by myself, Shacharis is an hour and a half, and even a yeshiva minyan does not daven an hour and a half, Shacharis. So, and I feel it changes my day. Am I allowed to daven b'yechidus? The Chazon Ish paskind, b'derech klal, you should go to minyan, but every once in a while. I wish he would have defined every once in a while, but he says b'akroi, you can take off to give you the chizuk of that tefillah. Now again, I wish I could quantify it a bit more. The story didn't give you the critical detail here. Actually, I think, well, now that I remember, I think he said once a month. I think that's what he said. Once a month, you can deliberately not go to minyan because you want to have that type of tefillah. Again, what does that mean in terms of tefillah b'tzibur chayva or whatever it is? Of course, on the other hand, Rav Chaim Kanevsky says over and over again, it's a chayva. On the other hand, it's meforsim, his famous psak about the guy that didn't have a hat. It's a peladik psak. He says, they're about to have a minyan. My hat is somewhere else. By the time I get my hat, I may miss the minyan. Should I daven b'yechidus without my hat? Or should I get my hat and daven daven b'tzibur rather. Daven b'tzibur without my hat? Or get my hat and daven b'yechidus? Rav Chaim Kanevsky paskin to a ben yeshiva, it is better to daven b'yechidus with your hat than daven in the minyan without your hat. That's what Rav Chaim said. Rav Shlomo Zalman was chaylik in that. Rav Shlomo Zalman said, Fishtetzach, Chavishas, wearing a hat and even wearing a jacket, he said, is not going to override Tefila B'tzibur. Tefila B'tzibur is more important than hat jacket. So although you should wear a hat and a jacket, but if the choice is hat and jacket b'yechidus, or no hat and no jacket b'tzibur, you should do Tefila B'tzibur. So I'm not machriya, obviously I'm not going to be machriya on this, but it seems to be a big machlokas among contemporary gedolim as to what you do. Okay, we'll stop here. I'm afraid of Purim and